How does somebody argue with a racist? I'll be honest, this is something I really struggle with because racism is an emotional bias. It's irrational, it's pseudoscience, it's anti-scientific, it's based on fear. Racial politics has been used as a very potent tool of division and gaining social power and control. And it's very hard to have a informed debate and argument against emotions because empiric science, rational thinking, logic and emotion are very at odds with each other. It's almost trying to convince a Christian logically that God doesn't exist. There's no evidence for God. You're arguing against a set of beliefs that are non-falsifiable, and that's where I struggle. Because a lot of people claim the accusation of racism is boring now. But what's more boring is the fact that I have to argue against it. Because rest assured, if you're the victim of racism, which I'm not, it's more boring than being called out for your bigotry. And I understand it. People don't like being called out. The far right are the biggest victims. Nigel Farage is one of the biggest victims. And they don't like being called out for what they are. And that does upset them. But how do you argue against this? I think with Reform UK specifically, some of them can be reached. I think probably 20%, 25% could be convinced that Farage is a demagogue, he's lying, he doesn't have your best interests at heart, he's trying to sow racial division, he doesn't really care about you unless you're rich and white. I think they can be convinced. But there's a good amount that just won't be convinced. They hold that belief that people of a darker hue to them are essentially different. It's racial essentialism that somehow people with melanin in their skin and different values, they come from a different part of the world, they have different religion and values, are less than. And because that's an irrational, non-scientific belief they hold, how can I argue with science? Because I could talk about the fact that race is a social construct, that racial science or scientific racism is a ideology that has no real scientific basis, that race is a social construct that has been used to divide people in a very specific and very calculated way, and that the real cure to racism is just simply exposure. Having exposure to people who are different to you literally solves racism. People who live in the city are less likely to be racist to people who live in the rural areas of, be it England or America. And that's the real solution, I think. You can't argue, again, against emotions. Emotions are, I think, inherently irrational. That's the point. You need to at least balance where your emotion is coming from and then use critical thinking to identify, is this emotion valid? What is it? And does it cause harm? And everybody knows that racism causes harm. That's why dog whistle politics are so important to the far right, because they know they can't be explicitly racist. They have to use coded language. And the only way to argue against the coded language is call it out and highlight what it really means. Immigration is really, we don't want brown people coming over and undermining our social fabric, and just have the debate. Because when someone tells me, oh, it's racist that you call me, but it's boring that you call me racist, I have to argue against that. Well, don't be racist then. Because if you are being called racist, and to a point where it's boring, I think the problem is you, not the person who is calling it out. And we definitely do live in a victim mentality, especially the far right are the biggest victims, where there's such a grievance culture, and that's part of fascism. Like, Nigel Farage is a classic victim. Everyone's out to get him. The political establishment, the left-wing media, he's saying the truth, and everybody's out to get him. And that's a very powerful tool to use, because it's not true, but it kind of makes people think that, yeah, we are the victims. Us white men are the victims. And it's ironic to me, because they can't see the fact that when they play the victim and say that they're the victim of racism against them for being white, is that they don't see how their opinions impact people, the world, policy, and how do you argue with emotion, irrational beliefs, cognitive and irrational biases that all humans have? We all have biases. But how do you argue with someone out of not being racist? Especially in a time of dog whistle politics, where there's that plausible deniability, and we're more divided than ever, where people who call out racism are now the problem. How do we contend with this? I think it's really difficult. I really do. I don't have all the answers. I wish I did. But I think it's something we need to just talk about and not be shy about calling it what it is. I think we should be able to call a spade a spade. And people don't like that. But when someone is being ignorant, racist, stupid, ill-informed, I think we should be adults and have that conversation. And if you get upset by someone calling you a racist, I think you need to check your priors, your axioms, your values, and maybe you do hold racist beliefs. And then ask your question, why do you? What harm is being caused? And who's convinced you that racism is the solution to society's problems? Comment below, how do you argue with a racist? And I'll see you in the next video.